Yeah, so it's a financial fair play breach is how the kind of story is being positioned. That obviously is linked to the profit and sustainability regulations that the Premier League introduced in 2013. So you are allowed to lose a cumulative £105 million over 3 years, and the breach here for Everton reports to a £120 million or thereabouts breach during a 3 year period. So the breach itself, if you kind of put that side by side, we're talking about a roughly 19.5, £20 million breach of those regulations. So that is the crux of what the points deduction is for.
Sure, and Everton have come out quite experienced, and I suppose there isn't much precedent set in this field. Do you think that's fair? That comment? Do you think Everton have a right to feel aggrieved?
I think that's the really tricky thing in the bigger picture of this, and that notion of the word proportionality. We've never seen the Premier League deduct points for these profit and sustainability regulations, and that's part of the kind of other backstory here and some of the wider narrative that we need to be aware of. So there is no precedent, there is no benchmark, and this is the first points deduction linked to these regulations. So it is the only one of its kind, and I think that's interesting given the fact that we've had 10 years of these regulations within that league, and this is the first time that a sanction has been met. So it was always going to be the case that whichever points deduction came first, and if there was going to be one, is a separate issue that we should probably cover as well, because there's been that notion of perhaps there was never going to be a punishment for this breaking these restrictions. So it does kind of feel like almost a watershed moment, and that's where people will look at, well, is that then 10 points, is that fair based on the breach? And it really does come down to individual circumstances and the independent commission in this case as well, to determine what an acceptable breach is. The problem is everyone will have their own opinion on what an acceptable breach is, and you can understand the club position in that regard. The breach is fairly clear from a financial perspective, but the punishment that goes with that is the sticking point, and I don't think we'll get to a silver bullet answer on that one because of all that wider stuff that's happened in the space over the years.
I think it's important. Well, through blinkers, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it is a big moment, and I think other clubs, will be worried naturally. And obviously, again, the narrative looks to City and Chelsea in that regard, because we know that there's a huge case against Manchester City and the number of potential breaches there down the years. And then also the Chelsea situation is another interesting subplot, and again, a very different and unique situation linked to the ownership of that particular club in a previous time. So it does feel like it's kind of a big watershed moment, if you will, and that then goes back to the 10 points for Everton, and everybody will now then start to compare, well, so if that's 10 points for Everton, what is the next thing that's coming down the track dependent on the case? So I think we are at some sort of kind of moment in time here whereby there will now be also a lot of chaos that ensues, because you're going to have potential compensation fees that we've already seen from clubs that are targeting Everton in this regard in replace of relegation and lost earnings. You're going to have the other cases that are coming in over the top. There's also the narrative of independent regulation that's looming, and a little bit of this is about the Premier League trying to flex their muscle and get their house in order to say that we can sanction and we don't need that independent regulator that people are calling for. So there's loads of little subplots there still in the broader context of English football and how it goes forward in the future. And I think you're right. It does really feel like this could be the moment that we look back on in a few years and go, well, that was the catalyst for a number of things that happen next. We just don't know which way some of those next questions are going to fall at this stage.
Yeah, for sure. And deal.
Yeah, I think it's going to be kind of mitigation, proportionality. Those will be the kind of things that Everton are focusing on. I think obviously the punishment is there now, and the appeal, the kind of best case scenario, of course, is it gets overturned fully, but I get the feeling that we're probably not in that particular line of thought at the minute. So you're kind of looking at maybe a reduction on appeal linked to some of these mitigating circumstances. And again, that goes around the whole thing, as you said, around the war in Ukraine is a factor for Everton that is not affecting a number of other clubs, but there's also some around the COVID losses and what they claim for there versus other clubs, and that benchmarking exercise again is not easy to do on a kind of one size fits all policy. So I get the sense that it will go down that road of on appeal you're probably looking to get this reduced as the first instance, and I think maybe overturned is a bit of a stretch based on where we are with some of those other factors, as we've said. But hey, we've not seen the appeal yet, and obviously there's a legal case behind that we need to be mindful of. So it's one of those where it's really difficult to put a definitive answer on it at this point in time.
And just quickly, I think the fact that they've used that is quite strong.
Yeah, I think this is interesting in the narrative because, of course, that is whether or not the sporting advantage actually occurs is a risk factor in all of this throughout time. If we go back to when those regulations were introduced, there was nothing to stop clubs gambling against those regulations apart from the fear of a sanction. It's just that's never happened in other cases for a variety of reasons, or the breach has not been, you've not tipped over the edge of the breach. But the way in which financial mismanagement occurs at club level, or they're trying to potentially overspend to compete, and it is tricky in the Premier League because there is a big gap between the big clubs and the rest, and how do you bridge that gap? There is a sporting integrity question in all of that, which is absolutely a valid question. But that kind of notion of you are systematically attempting, or not attempting to, but you are gambling against those regulations, or you are pushing up against those regulations. You are trying to do that for a particular reason, and I think that's where the phrase of the sporting advantage comes in. Now, whether or not that actually came to pass depends on how we define the sporting advantage. Of course, Everton didn't want to be in relegation battles in the last few years, and probably wanted to be higher up in the table. But that notion of sporting advantage can have different connotations dependent on the level. And I think that's where the compensation challenges from the likes of Burnley, Leeds, Southampton, Leicester become interesting, because then we're talking about a sporting advantage that is maybe the difference between staying up or not. And we might not see that necessarily as a sporting success, but it might be termed as a sporting advantage over other clubs.
Sure. No, fantastic.